We're going to talk a little bit more about, now that we've talked about religion and politics and religion and social discourse, we're going to look a little bit about how the media are responsible for all the problems that we find in our, that wasn't it. So we're going to talk about the challenges that are faced by news writers and reporters when they cover religion and how they might deal with some best practices of doing that. So we have two speakers who are going to talk to us today. Jennifer Dobner, who used to work for the Associated Press, and I actually met her at Sunstone recently when she was giving a presentation about her coverage of the LDS Church recently, and we had a jolly good time afterwards talking about her career. I'll let her tell you a little bit more about that, but I think you'll find her talking points very interesting, and her background really important. Also, we have Cecile Homes from the University of South Carolina. She's as she noted earlier, the former president of the Religion News Writers Association. Did I say that right? She's also just finished being the chair of the Religion Media Interest Group of an international academic society in journalism and mass communications, and she's a good friend of mine from the University of South Carolina, where we used to work together. I'm not going to read all the good stuff about you. I'll let you brag about yourself, and just in order to save some time. So please give a welcome to first to Jennifer. Thank you.
Thank you, and I apologize I'm coming late today. I had a morning thing I couldn't get rid of, so. And I'm really nervous, I'll just tell you that. I'm a good talker if we're just having a conversation, but I don't do the presentation thing. I'm not an academic. I'm sure I'm the dumbest person in the room right now. But I can tell you about my experiences covering religion. I've been a reporter just shy of 20 years, and I've mostly been a generalist, like most reporters. We have to get thrown at a different problem every day. But when I went to the AP in 2005, it was specifically to be the Mormon Church beat writer. And I have to say, and presently I should say, I left AP in the spring, and I'm presently the contract correspondent for Reuters here in Utah, and I do some other freelance stuff, kind of making it up as I go along a little bit. I have to say that when I went to the AP, and I have notes, but I probably won't be good at following them, I didn't really know what I was getting into covering the Mormon Church. I mean, if you live here in Utah, you sort of know that when they talk about the church, they mean like capital T, capital C, right? But I'm not a Mormon, I'm not from here, I'm not of the culture in any way, and even though I'd been living among Mormons for probably about 10 years at that point, I really hadn't been paying attention. Like, I wasn't really reading Mormon history, I didn't really sort of understand Mormon theology, and it becomes sort of immediately clear that you need to get all of that in order to do a fair and a decent job of covering the church. So it was a pretty daunting task, and probably I would say it's been like the hardest thing I've ever done in my career, is to learn how to figure out this unique group of people and this unique theology. So this sort of leads me into this question that I'm told we're supposed to explore in this session, which is, what are the challenges of covering and representing a religion and religion in American public life? And I think there are many to really doing it well. Part of it for a lot of journalists, and there is a section of the journalist population that are specifically, religion reporters. But that is, as many people will tell you now, a really shrinking pool. There are fewer and fewer of those people in the time when newsrooms are getting smaller. Having a religion reporter is a luxury that most papers and newsrooms of any kind just really can't afford. They don't have the resources to do it anymore. So biblical literacy sometimes, I think, is a big hurdle for journalists. I can tell you also, I should say, we believe in objectivity in journalism. We like to build a nice little wall around ourselves, and I think that it's not the same to cover a church the way you cover a corporation or a government agency. a sports team. I mean, they're not the same things, and as a journalist, you would tend to approach it in the same way, but people of faith don't really like that. In my experience, you know, even the Easter and Christmas only type of Christians, they don't appreciate it when you ask questions about their faith, about the way they practice it, about how that intersects with their politics. They become uncomfortable and, in many ways, a little bit defensive. I've had a number of conversations with Mormons who have just said, you shouldn't ask that. You just shouldn't ask that. And I'm like, okay. We're in really different places. So, but religion is, you know, deeply rooted in public life. It informs so much of what we think and the way we shape our societies and the way what we agree is, you know, acceptable sort of social practices. It's everywhere, and I think sometimes we fail to recognize it. And I think reporters in particular sometimes without understanding more about religion, or if some are unchurched, not all, but some are unchurched. But I think that you know, a biblical literacy gap can be a problem. If you can miss the story if you don't understand the context of something. There's a really good book published in 2009 called Blind Spot, When Journalists Don't Get Religion. And in a foreword to that book, Michael Gerson, the Washington Post columnist and a former fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, points out that reporters often miss the story for these reasons. They don't see the religious underpinnings in the conversation sometimes. He points to things like Quaker abolitionists or African American Christians who fought against slavery and, you know, leaned on their spirituality to help them oppose segregation. You probably see it in the pro-life movement, in the anti-war movement, global poverty, civil rights. It's not always, I mean, it's sort of maybe acknowledged that Dr. Martin Luther King, for example, certainly was a preacher, but I don't know if all journalists, you know, dive into that and explore that. Let's see. And journalists sort of acknowledge this. There was a report released in April by the University of Southern California's Annenberg School of Journalists. They surveyed 2,000 consumers, news consumers, and 800 journalists, asking about attitudes and perceptions of news coverage and religion. Among reporters, 51.9% said religion stories are more challenging for them, and 1/2 say that that's because they have a lack of knowledge about religion. 19% of reporters said they were very knowledgeable, and only 1/3 considered themselves knowledgeable at all. 2/5 say a big problem for them is just a lack of time. These, I can tell you in my own experience, I spent like 7 years reading books about only Mormons. Nothing else. I just was trying to figure this out so that I could do it fairly and responsibly. 31% of reporters in this same survey said they didn't really know what sources there were for them to get the information they needed to even begin to cover this stuff. So in 2005, as I said, I'd been living here about 10 years, but I hadn't covered the church, and I really didn't know what I was in for. And I can say that I didn't really know enough about religion in general or in the specific when it came to Mormons to really do an adequate job. I mean, I'm an Episcopalian. I am a person of faith. I go to church on Sundays. I pray before we have the service. I don't eat before communion, but I don't think I could tell you in 2005 why I did those things. I'd never really thought about it before. It was my practice. That's all I could tell you. So this job really challenged me to think about things in a really new and different way. When you start covering Mormonism, I found not knowing the details is kind of a problem. Religion and religious practice here is just a different matter. There's a lot of focus on the details, and when you write about the faith, there's no like sort of gross generalization of an idea. You can't just sort of gloss over something about Joseph Smith or the lost 116 pages. You just can't do it because boom, there it is in your email. Somebody's telling you that you got it wrong, and they've got like a 27-paragraph explanation for why you got it wrong. And And that can happen within like minutes of something hitting the wire. And I was just not prepared for that at all. Like the internet, not your friend, right? And Latter-day Saints, and I haven't really covered other faith traditions, but Latter-day Saints are not shy about defending their faith, pointing out your interpretation of the facts and how it differs from theirs. So that was kind of challenging and a little bit painful sometimes and very frustrating. And I have sort of this foolish policy that if you write to me, I will write you back. I'm stupidly going to engage you in a conversation because I think that that's really important. And if you took the time to read what I wrote, I should take the time to, respond to your thoughts. And I do appreciate it on the one hand, unless you use bad language, and then I don't really respond to that. So here's what I did as a beat reporter to try to figure this out. I started out by meeting with church officials because I had an assigned public relations person. I still do. And just said, okay, who are the people that write about you? Who are the people that talk about you? Why are they credible? Why are they not credible? Who do you like and who do you don't like? What are the 5 books you think I should read? Who are the 5 people that you think I should know? Can you introduce me to those people? Will you make help me understand you? And so, and then from that sort of group of people, then I asked each one of those people sort of the same question kind of over and over again until I built myself sort of a network of people who I could rely on, who could just have lunch with me and explain to me, why they go to Sunstone or why they don't, there are 2 different kinds of Mormons there. There's a Sunstone Mormon might be treated with suspicion by other people in their congregation. And I just very slowly over time tried to build people that would help me build my credibility in writing and reporting about these things. And I relied on academics and historians and book publishers and a couple of my Mormon neighbors and just all kinds of different people that crossed my path. And it was probably the most valuable thing I ever did. And because when you let people just talk about their own experience and their own belief system, it's much more, I think it's much more genuine for one thing. And you start to understand that, you're not talking about a monolith here. You're talking about a group of people with a lot of different viewpoints. Not every Mormon looks like every other Mormon or sounds like every other Mormon. I also developed kind of a little tiny group of people who have been like off the record sources. And often they get like this frantic phone call from me in the middle of my deadline frenzy saying, okay, if I say this way, how many people am I going to offend? And so you have to kind of learn to parse the language. I mean, one of the challenges about religion is jargon. I heard you say earlier, a bishop and pastor. Well, pastor makes sense to the non-Mormon grandmother in Iowa. So how do I explain, in about 20 words or less, what those differences are in a way that's accurate, but also doesn't offend the Mormon reading population? You can't call the Quorum of the 12 Apostles necessarily by its name on the first reference. Or if you do, then you have to have, the clause that explains that that's the second tier of leadership and blah, 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 blah. It maybe doesn't sound very hard, but it is kind of hard in a way to make something, anybody, we all belong to different groups. And we talk to each other in shared language. And if you're trying to explain that to someone who doesn't know anything about it, it's always hard to make them sort of get it. And so I sort of like also developed sort of a little file where I would keep sort of stock explanations. I do it around, like I cover polygamy, so I have done it around the polygamous groups. I have a little thing that explains, the history of the FLDS or the history of the Davis County Cooperative Society, so that I don't have to write it over and over again, but I have it right there, and I've parsed the language down to a way so that it makes sense to anybody, even if you know nothing. I mean, I think it does. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe someone should tell me if it doesn't. But I think that it's sort of a watering down, and I think that can be also a little bit offensive sometimes to Mormons. they just wonder why you wouldn't call a bishop and why you would have to explain it. But so, you know, part of the conversation here is about how effective the media really is in representing religious beliefs. And the USC survey was not very kind. 66, almost 67% of the public believes we don't really do it very well and it's way too sensational. 27% said, only 27% said it was accurate and fair. And 37% said that the news media is hostile to religion and to religious people. Of course, reporters get defensive then, and we see it differently. About 30% said, 40% said the coverage was accurate and fair, and only 25% said reporters are hostile. And 59% of reporters said that religious people are just too sensitive about religion stories, which I've talked to those people. They are sensitive. I would be sensitive too. I mean, I think really if you start asking me too much about the Episcopal Church, I get a little bristly on the back of my neck because that's mine. You know, the thing about religion is it might be a shared experience on Sunday morning in corporate worship, but it's also an intensely personal experience for people. And if you feel like what's being written about you is attacking you personally or judging you personally, who likes that? Nobody likes that. Nobody likes that. So I think, you know, probably none of this is surprising to any of you. But I don't know how you really explain it. I think that journalism and religion are kind of at cross purposes in terms of communications messages. There's an editor, a former editor at the Nashville Tennessean, his name was John, I think it's Siegenthaler. He said, or Siegenthaler, pardon me, said religion and media are two alien cultures, one rooted largely in a search for facts and the other grounded in a discovery of faith beyond fact. And Mark Silk, who many of you may be familiar with, he's a professor at Trinity College in Connecticut and runs the Leonard Greenberg Center for the Study of Religion in Public Life, wrote in the book Unsecular Media that, quote, when the news media set out to communicate religious subject matter, they run up against institutions jealously guarding what they take to be their own prerogative. For religions are themselves systems of communications designed in the first instance to facilitate the exchange of information between the mundane world and the realm of the sacred. He goes on to say that, you know, as a reporter, you can't favor one faith tradition over another, and you have to sort of tread carefully around things like articles of faith and stay away from supernatural events, things that you can't explain. I mean, in journalism, we rely on empirical evidence. I will tell you that I've been a Sunday school teacher for 10 years. I will tell you that when the kids ask me about heaven, I say, I don't really know. You know, I work in empirical facts every day. Sometimes I can't explain why I'm also a person of faith, but I am. I have hopes, I have beliefs, but I can't give you a for sure, because that's kind of something I'm still working out. And I think that, well, one other thing that Mark Silk said is that, quote, to the religious, the studied neutrality can look like indifference or worse, but it's worth considering that the degree to which the constraints may reflect not a secular bias on the media's part, but a common understanding of what is acceptable in discourse in the public square. I mean, when I come at a story the exact same way, whether I'm covering capital punishment and the execution at the state prison, or I'm coming at the church. And I don't mean that in like they're the same thing, but I use the same critical skills in my brain. I look for the same types of elements. But there's a big gap here. When I've covered conference, and I generally cover like prayer to prayer, you know, opening prayer, closing prayer, I'm there for every session except they won't let me go to priesthood because I'm a woman. And I had a big fight with them about that. And they kicked me out. But then they send me the talks anyway, but electronically, so I don't really get the difference. But what they told me was, well, you know, sometimes, President Hinckley was still in charge of the church then, sometimes President Hinckley gets pretty direct with the men. And I'm like, is he going to swear? Because I've pretty much used all those words, and it's not going to be something that I haven't heard. I don't think he did swear, but it wasn't in the text that I got anyway. But here's the trouble about covering something like conference, and it's a pretty, I should be kind. If you don't know what it is, I'm sure most of you do, but twice a year the Mormon Church has a 2-day conference in Salt Lake City. About 100,000 people churn through the conference center. It's an amazing feat to watch it happen. And they hear, 6 hours on Saturday and 4 hours on Sunday of inspirational music and words of guidance and faith-promoting stuff. I actually kind of enjoy it, and I've learned some things. But it's really, from a religious and cultural perspective, it's a really important moment for Mormons. They get a chance to see their leaders. People travel from all over the world to be here. You get to be in the same room with them. If you're a reporter and you write for a secular organization, it's kind of boring. I mean, it's really boring sometimes. But it got more interesting. It got more interesting over time, and I will say that I have sometimes, offered a prayer of thanks for things like temple announcements and appointments of new general authorities, because those are like actual news things to a reporter. But then when I learned, you just can't turn in a story that's all sort of religion speak to the desk. They will be like, that's a brief, if we're running it at all. But when I learned about the nuance of Mormon speak and of the way the culture works and the way they talk and the way they correlate things and the way a general authority will quote somebody who's been long dead but was an important person in the church 35, 45, 50 or longer years ago, then I started to get it. Because then I started to figure out how to read kind of between the lines and figure out what the message was and how those speeches were sort of directing the faith in this direction or that, or we're not changing this message. We believe modesty is a good thing. We've always thought it was a good thing. We still believe it. But it took me probably, I would say, about 4 years. That's kind of embarrassing. But about 4 years to really learn what the story was, so I could watch for patterns. And there's a fascinating group that meets in Salt Lake City, which some of you may or may not know about, called the Mormon Alliance. And this group of people, every Monday after conference, these are largely disenfranchised or excommunicated Mormons, and they get together on the Monday after conference, and they sit around and dissect every talk. They've kept better notes than me all weekend long, and then they sit around and talk about what they heard and what that means and how that reflects what President Kimball said in 19 whatever, and going to that was also really enlightening, because that's how you learn. That's how you take it down another layer, and I just didn't really get that. When I started to figure out, it was right around 2008, and right when the church was involved in this little political thing going on in California called Proposition 8. You may have heard of it. But when they started at that conference, 30 days before the vote, talking about the proclamation on the family and traditional family values, and I was all of a sudden, ding, 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 the light goes off, right? And I'm okay, you have a story now, because you've been writing all about Proposition 8, and then you could figure out how many speakers over 2 days made those references. And then I could say, well, nobody talked about politics except that they talked about politics. And so that's when, the religion reporting gets good. But it takes some time, and most reporters these days, they don't have a lot of time. I think part of what maybe some Mormons see presently in the presidential election coverage and about Romney and his religion is they see reporting that they think maybe is biased against the church or biased against Mr. Romney for his faith tradition. But I talked about this at Sunstone this year, is that I just think that a lot of the reporters, they don't understand the language, and they're political reporters, sometimes writing about religion, and so they're out of their bailiwick. And it's not easy stuff, it's kind of hard stuff. So it just takes time. But the stories get better and more interesting, the more opportunities you get to cover this stuff. And along those same lines, the USC survey found that the public's primary interest in religion news is really about spirituality. And that has its place on religion pages on Saturday mornings, but you know, as a daily beat kind of reporting thing, I just can't write about spirituality every single day. You have to write about the way the church intersects in the community, things they're doing. I mean, the Mormon church here is a very good sort of corporate citizen. They do a lot of things in the community. There are a lot of stories to write there, but what we know is that people mostly want to read about spiritual practice. 27, hang on, I went too fast. 32% of the public surveyed by USC also said they thought religious coverage was too driven by scandal. So that makes perfect sense to me as a reporter, because a scandal's a story no matter who you're talking about. And but I think that most people of faith would probably see something like that as you know, a private matter that the church should be allowed to work out, you know, out of the public eye and not in the newspaper. I know that when I was working in Idaho at a small newspaper in Idaho Falls, there was a story out of an even smaller community called Rexburg where some doctor had been accused of sexual abuse of a large number of patients. And it was the women filed a class action suit against this person. And we just got a flood of letters to the editor from people who said, "Why are you even writing about this? The church has dealt with it." And there seemed to be no recognition that like a felony level crime had been committed and that there was an appropriate place in the public forum for this to not only be a story, but for this to be a public matter handled, you know, it was a criminal matter. But in that community where the reading public was largely Mormon, they felt like it was a church matter and not for journalists to delve into. So that's kind of interesting. I do think that reporters really fall short when we don't get the details right or when we characterize people as monolithic, you know. I think it happens easily and you don't really intend it, but it does happen, and when we miss the story or mess it up, I think that's when people think that we're hostile or we don't care about religion. I don't really know any reporters who are like that. Most of us try really hard to get it right, and I think for me and for most people I know, the goal is always to listen respectfully and learn and try to write respectfully and fairly represent people, but we don't always see eye to eye about those things. So that's all I've got. Thanks very much.
I'm going to come at this at a slightly different perspective from Jennifer because of the fact that I was a religion specialist myself for about 15 years, and I still cover religion. I had sort of an interreligious dilemma when I started thinking about what I wanted to say. I thought, well, maybe I need to talk about what happened when the ambassador was killed, and I need to be, you know, involved in describing that, and I need to talk about how we should have covered that, for how the press should have approached it. Then I thought, no, maybe I need to talk about the election, because that's going to be on everybody's mind, because my assignment really was, no offense, Brian, it was very general. So what I decided to do instead was to talk about what I know best, which is religion reporting and basic standards for that. I do think there is a dearth of religion reporters who are full-time specialists nowadays. That's really a loss. I don't know what the long-term impact of that is going to be. I will tell you that the Religion News Writers Association, the organization that I'm a past president of, continues to add members. Many of them, I think, are part-timers or people who are doing religion as part of what they do on their beat. And their job may be anything from covering the impact of the church on the local community in terms of projects such as homelessness, housing, other areas in which there are social services involved, especially in smaller communities that can be true, or it may be as significant as the presidential election. The problem is, where do you go to find the standards? That was part of what the Religion News Writers Association was created to settle. So to give you some background in that, I'm going to rely on a booklet that the RNA puts out, and it's called A Primer on Journalism's Best Beat, so that I'll give you some idea of where people come from on this. The booklet talks about the fact sometimes journalists ignore it until it pounces on them. Others pursue it like a skilled hunter. For some, it's a full-time job. For others, it's an occasional factor in the occasional story. For all, it's a powerful force that can enhance coverage of almost any topics. So however you come to report about religion in the mainstream media, you're in the right place. You learn quickly that there's some things you can do to deal with the seismic shifts that are going on in religion coverage and in journalism right now. Basically, one of the first of those is to ask people why they read or listen to the news. So you end up doing something like what Jennifer described. You end up taking your own little informal survey when you're out in the community, when you talk to your friends and your neighbors. If you come to the beat as I did in my late 20s in North Carolina and you don't know a Southern Baptist from Missouri Synod Lutheran, and you don't realize, you know absolutely nothing about the Hasidim, and there's a major Jewish missionary element moving into the state, you're all of a sudden just in a deluge of information, and your editors are looking to you and saying, how do you think we should cover this? What should be done? And then if you don't give them something they understand, they complain and shoot it back and say, this isn't a story, or this is not going to make any sense to anybody but the people inside this community, Cecile. Too often, the undertow that remains invisible to journalists is the undertow that religion and spirituality pulls in our culture. It's an undertow that can be related to almost every subject. So what is religion news? Breaking news, investigative reporting, trend stories, features, profiles, analysis. It can be international, it can be national, it can be local news, politics, sports, business, education, crime, arts and entertainment, science, lifestyle, fashion, travel, food, and even more than that. Stories about one religion, several religions, or the interaction among them can also be a religion story. Stories about institutional religion, individual houses of worship, denominations, or entire religions, i.e., the regular meeting of the Mormon Church here in Salt Lake City. There are national conferences of almost every major mainline denomination, and then the Catholic bishops meet. That's a religion story. Spirituality that takes place outside of institutional walls. Beyond news stories, religion is often a frequent topic of opinion columns, blogs, nowadays complete websites on the internet. It's becoming an even bigger deal when it comes to tweets. I mean, it's everywhere. You can't ignore it. It's important. Why should we cover religion? Religion is interesting and important, but media organizations are saying, we don't have the time for that kind of specialist anymore. We don't know if it's possible to let someone do that. Here's why. 6 in 10 Americans say religion is very important in their lives. That means they're likely to read, watch, or listen to stories about religion. Religion stories connect with viewers and with readers. Connecting with the audience is a universal goal of a media organization. Many religion journalists say they've gotten more feedback on the religion beat than on any beat they've ever been on before. It's amazing how interested people are. Just as a slight aside, I've been in a position where someone has introduced me as, this is our reporter, and I had been sort of like conducted under someone's wing, mainly because I was the only person who had written about what was going on in the Southern Baptist Convention at the national level for local Baptists in North Carolina in a long time. There hadn't been anyone in my area. This is our reporter. And I was like, well, wait a minute. I don't want to be your reporter, you know. What about objectivity? And they'd been very nice to me and answered my many inane questions, but you run into that with some regularity. 1/4 of internet users, and I think this number has gone up, have searched for information about religion online, and half of those have looked for information about faiths other than their own. That implies they're interested in reading about religion, that they want to know more about religion. Religion's a factor in the issue Americans consistently name as their top concerns: terrorism, war, education, health care, immigration, the environment, and the health of the economy. Still, many media outlets fail to include religion in their market studies. The Religion News Writers Association advises that if your outlet does not ask about religion, to encourage the market survey employees to do so. I can tell you from personal experience, you have to ask for that. You have to say, if you're going to get us demographics on who's reading the fashion section and who's reading the business section or who's reading business news, could you please get us demographics on who's reading religion news? Because we're not going to know who we're preaching to, who we're writing for, until we know who our readers are. Same thing can be done, obviously, for electronic media and for the internet. Across the nation, even though some media outlets are trimming religion news under the mistaken notion that new and better religion news will help attract new audiences, this may just be wrong. The Readership Institute, a massive research project on newspaper readership based at Northwestern University, showed that readers were highly dissatisfied with existing religion news. Based on that and other findings, the Institute did not include religion news as among the top 9 content areas on which newspapers need to focus. However, there are religion scholars and media scholars who believe that the problem is in how the questions about religion are asked, not in, the fact that people are interested in religion. If you ask, would you read religion news, that's going to mean a different question than to someone if you ask them, are you interested in international news that has religious overtones? As David and people like him very well know, the formation and the phrasing of a question makes all the difference in the world. I do think there can still be a case made for people who specialize in religion reporting. It's one of the most complex subjects that journalists ever cover. It requires precision in wording, attention to nuance, and knowledge of a wide range of religious traditions. Also, most religious issues are related to the Bible or to other scripture. Religion news specialists, as again Jennifer described, have got to quickly become knowledgeable on the sacred literature of the groups they're covering. Imagine if all of a sudden, with no background, you needed to be able to understand references to the Bible, the Quran, the Talmud, the Torah, the Bhagavad Gita, Tibetan holy books. I mean, this is what it's like. Just all of a sudden, people expect you to know everything that they know. It's almost as though religion is so ingrained inside us, so much a part of, knit into the being of who we are, that we forget, and when I say we, I mean just average practitioners of the faith, that a reporter is not going to have that background. Journalists are expert at reporting facts, but religion reporters can also become skilled at reporting about beliefs that cannot be proved. That's why I think we still need religion specialists. They learn to ask questions respectfully while also maintaining the skepticism necessary for covering the news. In fact, let me give you an example of what happens when you get it right. When you get it wrong. There was a major news weekly who once misquoted the Reverend Jerry Falwell as referring to an assault ministry, like an assault rifle, when what actually Jerry said was a salt ministry, as in Matthew 5:13. Well, I mean, an assault ministry, Falwell took enough heat and was enough of a, he loved the press and was inclined to, engage reporters in all sorts of dialogue whenever he had the opportunity, that I can imagine what it would have been like if he had been quoted as saying he was in charge of an assault ministry. The names of religious groups alone require an expert to keep them right. While most Baptists in the United States belong to 4 denominations, there are more than 70 with a variety of practices, traditions, and beliefs. Meanwhile, the Presbyterian Church USA and the Presbyterian Church of America have vastly different beliefs but very similar names. Once covering the Southern Baptists, I was sending in a story and I said, and these people who were nominated were chosen by the Committee on Committees, and they will be voted on by messengers from local churches. And I got this curt email back that said, Cecile, what in the name of heaven is a Committee on Committee? Did you make this up? And I said, no, I didn't make it up. The Committee on Committees is what they call it. And no, I didn't make up messenger. That's what they call it. So we spent about 15 minutes on the phone kind of doing this little, you're nodding your head, Jennifer, kind of doing this little, tap dance to figure out how to do two things. And often this is the issue. How do you remain respectful and fair and just to the religious organization you're writing about by using terminology that will be clear, that is accurate, that isn't like, nomenclature that you just pulled out of your hat? How do you adhere to that value and at the same time respect the average newspaper reader who may know absolutely nothing or very, very little about Mormons and Southern Baptists? In fact, I find more and more, even today, that the knowledge of religion in America is not what it needs to be. Many people, if you ask them about Mormons, if they don't have a friend in the church or they haven't actually talked to one, will tell you it is the people who ride the bicycles. It is the young boys riding bicycles. That's all they know. And that's horrible, but it's true. I'm in no way defending, the ignorance, but most people can't name the first 4 Gospels of the Bible or the Declaration of Independence. They can't recite it. They don't know that. We're an ignorant nation in some ways. Public records and open meetings laws don't apply to the majority of religious reporting, and they don't apply to religion groups. So we've got to depend heavily on interviewing to get behind those. As the 1980s PTL scandal showed, when Jim Baker was convicted of mail fraud, if you don't go after people who may be doing things that aren't fair and aren't reasonable, if you don't investigate them, stories may actually never see the light of day, and the reader or the poor little person who is contributing to this ministry from some small town in the middle of nowhere is the person whose benefits are not getting served. The press has a responsibility to contribute to the public good and to continue to reach out. The other case for religion journalists' expertise is, in a breaking story, religion journalists will have the background to give you adequate news coverage of churches, terrorism attacks done in the name of faith, hate crimes, court rulings, and legislation involving religion and more. Here's some of the trends, and I thought it was interesting that the trends in religion news really reflect the trends in... Am I moving away from the mic? Okay. The notion of what religion news is and where it belongs has changed dramatically in the last 10 years. But the trends in religion news segue right into the things we've been talking about in this conference. The country is more religious diverse. Its religious makeup, even among Christians, is changing. More faiths are more common in neighborhoods throughout the country, and some of the practices of those faiths require special accommodations in schools, so this is coming into play more often in the average person's life. Crimes such as sexual abuse, terrorism, and financial wrongdoing have thrust religious groups into the news. Politics is heavily engaged with issues affected by religious beliefs, including abortion, end-of-life issues, stem cell research, same-sex marriage, and more. Religious denominations are and have been, I can tell you from experience, in the middle of bitter battles over homosexuality, abortion, and the roles of women. I don't think this is going to change anytime in the next 10 years. And the specificity of the battle within these individual religious communities is important. You've got to have some sort of background or know how to quickly get it to be able to cover them. People are practicing their faiths in very different ways, often switching houses of worship. They eschew the faith they were raised in and blend it with practices of more than one religion, or choose to express their faith outside religious institutions. Religion does have a more prominent role in international conflicts than ever before. The increasing numbers of evangelical Christians who are committed to sharing their faith in all venues of their lives are also calling more for religion specialists, people who know more about religion than just the average everyday. So what do you do when religion becomes the news? The relationship between the media and religion in the United States is an often adversarial pairing. The press is often skeptical of religious leaders. They, in turn, frequently mistrust the press. The relationship between the two gets even muddier when news about religion is the focal point of discussion. As far back as the early 1980s, experts were gathered by the Rockefeller Foundation for a conference called The Religion Beat, the reporting of religion in the media. The event drew Christian and Jewish clergy, broadcast and print journalists, and academics, among others. As is often true at this kind of event, conference participants actually disagreed on just how important a news subject religion actually is in our society and how it should be covered. What they did agree, though, was that Western intellectuals in the news media had severely underestimated religion's role in American culture and politics. Back that far, church historian Martin Marty cited an example from the 1979 hostage crisis in Iran. On February 4th, 1979, in an interview on the television show Issues and Answers, Admiral Stansfield Turner, according to Martin Marty, admitted, quote, that U.S. intelligence had Iran covered, its munitions and media, its banking and education. The only thing overlooked was religion, because everyone knew it had so little place and power in the modern world. This is the sort of trouble that so often gets us into trouble. This kind of attitude, quite simply, American involvement in Iraq and American involvement in Afghanistan, I think we have woefully underestimated the power of religion there. And I'm not taking a stance on our military involvement, but I'm saying that we just keep acting like religion and its impact on culture, everyday life, family, schools, not to mention in houses of worship, in the mosque, the temple, the synagogue, we underestimate its significance, how much it matters. I'd argue that clear, unbiased, and informed reporting is more essential today than ever. That reporting's not only essential on the home front, it's also essential on the international scene. In the United States, I think such reporting should include exploring religion's role in a nation where church and state are separate, considering the gradual shift among Americans to what I see as being a more privatized form of faith. I think people are moving to a place where a lot of what they do is to practice their faith in private. I think maybe some of the nuns are this type of person. I think we need to trace the history of religious thought and discourse in the United States. We need to be carefully distinguished between religion and spirituality in reporting and writing, and we need to acknowledge the impact of the nation's growing pluralism. Pluralism, perhaps, will be at its best and most effective if religion reporting and strong religion reporting continues, because without it, without someone out there on the front lines trying to interpret, understand, well, let me switch my list, I'm sorry. Trying to understand, interpret, and then repeat in a form that is clear to a wide cross-section of people the news of religion. Religious diversity is just going to happen. It's going to happen, and it may or may not have the impact that it could have. I think we can become a more religiously tolerant nation and a nation that will be more engaged in civil dialogue, even though we're becoming increasingly different, if we have strong stories about religion, and I mean strong stories at every level, especially on the web, which is the future, in social media, tweeting, online, broadcast. I just can't advocate for the need for it. So how do you make that happen? Well, one is things like associations. Americans are famous for our advent into voluntary associations since early in the history of the Republic. We've always been good at putting things together that would help us get to know one another better. So obviously, one thing that can happen, and journalists do this too, is you can engage in an organization like the Religion News Writers Association, which has its own website, and it alone will just put you in touch with a cross-section of other links. For example, about every 10 days, the RNA puts out a foundation-funded listserv called Religion Link. It'll give you a background, say, on what's happening among creationists in the advent of the presidential election, or what's the definitive story that could be written about religion as it relates to stewardship of creation in light of increasing interest in the rights of animals. So it's from very general to very specific sorts of stories. I want to close by noting that my advocacy of more religion news and of better and better informed religion reporting is borne out at least in one way. Last summer, there was a brand new association of religion writers started. This is the Religion News Writers Association in the United States, has had international members for years, but now there's another group. The International Association of Religion Journalists, IARJ, was founded by leading journalists from 23 countries and 6 continents at a meeting at the Rockefeller Foundation, Bellagio Center in Italy. Nearly 400 journalists from more than 90 nations have been accepted into the new organization. Here is the mission statement from the organization. Religion plays a very important role in the daily life of billions of people around the world, and we are a community of professionals who care enough about that to want to portray their beliefs and practices and their conflicts with accuracy, fairness, and balance, said Maria Paz Lopez, the senior religion writer at La Vanguardia in Barcelona, Spain. Global religion journalism comes with global responsibility. Reporting that increases understanding can reduce discrimination and promote civility. Inaccurate and irresponsible journalism can contribute to persecution and even inflame conflicts responsible for the suffering of millions. So I'm in favor of better education. Thank you.